Good afternoon. I'm Brian Davis. I'm the the ex-managing director of Green Labyrinth, which was a large training provider in the southwest of England. I've got about 35 plus years actually, as a adult trainer or in the adult training industry, ranging across multiple sectors. Had a lot of experience designing and delivering learning opportunities. And I started with e-learning in 1992. Would you believe that? 1992, that's an awful long time ago. And even virtual reality that we were using in 1996. So I've kind of been at the forefront of learning technologies. And most recently, I've been involved in the delivery of corporate universities, Unisys Corporation in particular, and also in the delivery of adult learning experiences in the workplace through a company called Green Labyrinth, which was the company that Steph and I set up and very recently sold. Steph?
Thank you, Brian. Yes, many thanks for the invitation to deliver our expertise for Global Digital Week 2022. Much appreciated. My humble beginnings were as an FE teacher in the information technology sector, which was very different many years ago. I then moved in to be e-learning manager, and I implemented a number of systems in an FE college, which brought a lot more digital awareness and technology into that arena. Subsequently to that, obviously with Brian, set up a training company nearly 12 years ago now. And as Brian has just said, that he and I sold it very recently. Moving on to the reasons why we have Exion below us is because we are obviously now moving on to the next phase of our careers, which is to support and deliver consultancy, mentoring and training within the adult world. So I've got a couple of questions here, which Brian and I are going to discuss. And Brian are going to take it, and I are going to take it in turns how we deliver these questions. Brian, I think you're down for the first one, so can I pass this back to you?
Yeah, absolutely. And it follows on quite nicely from what you were saying, Steph. I mean, you've been HR director of quite a large company. So from your experience, what would you say are the main barriers for engagement into learning for adults? And or whether that be formal training or indeed CPD or continuous professional development?
Yeah, I think there are obviously a lot of the people that I worked with were teachers. So CPD was actually a requirement for them to improve their practice. And that was relatively informal. However, there were still a number of barriers, and that was their time, the allocation of time. And I think that's a general issue and barrier for a lot of people, is that if they don't have allocated time for their learning, then they actually struggle to achieve that particular CPD unless it is acknowledged by management in a particular business, the necessity of the training, and it's very much pushed. It's also how much they value the content of the training. If they feel that they're being asked to train in something that isn't relevant to their role or potentially doesn't have the knowledge level that they require for promotion. I mean, there's different factors that need to be considered there. So in order for staff to engage, they need the full support from managers, and that is normally driven by the culture of the business that they work in. And that can be positive or negative, of course, depending on the stress levels of the business at the time. I know you have some comments on this, Brian, so I'll let you, Alan, put your comments in now.
Yeah, I'd just like to pick up on a couple of points you made there, actually. For me, the problem, I've been involved in continuous professional development since I was a boy. And really, the key thing for me is that there needs to be a desire to learn. And that's very much driven by the culture of learning within particular sectors. So, for instance, accountants and professional people will engage very heavily with CPD because it's a requirement of their institutes or their professional practices. Where that requirement doesn't exist, then there needs to be an imperative to learn, and that boils down to really the culture of an organisation. And you touched on it when you were saying, the allocation of time and acknowledgement and all the rest of these good things. But fundamentally, and I'm going to keep coming back to this theme during this session, is the training needs to work for people. It needs to recognise the way people learn. And if it's not easy, if it's hard to learn, or the learning is delivered in a way that puts barriers up for people, then they will resist it. So it's really about the accessibility. For me, it's about the accessibility, the desire, and the culture of an organisation to create the support or the imperatives to learn within a business.
Okay, can I just pick up on the next question then for you? What are the range of different delivery methods that could be used to engage adults in both formal training and or CPD, in your opinion?
Well, again, if I can go back to the whatever way learning is delivered, it has to recognize the fundamental way our brains learn. Otherwise, you're building barriers in. So adults learn in different ways, but there is a commonality. In other words, there's an acquisition of knowledge, there's a contextualization of knowledge, and then an application of knowledge. So those are the three sort of steps that we go through as adults. Adults, but there's a further level of complexity on that because there's also a preferred learning style. And I know this was something that you were very heavily involved in with our previous company, Steph, in that we designed the training to leverage people's preferred manner of learning, whether it's auditory, visual, kinesthetic, etc. And in certain professions and age groups, this is further complex. There's further complexity brought in through the delivery mechanism. So it can be the technology of delivery can actually prove to be a big barrier. So for say an 18 to 20 to 30-year-old, one of the millennial generation, delivery through a phone or a technologically leveraged method is quite normal. But for somebody our age that has no particular technological bent, that actually can be a huge barrier to them engaging in the learning process. So while methods and medias may have changed and evolved over the fundamental over the last few years, the fundamental learning processes for adults and indeed children hasn't changed a great deal. The mechanisms through which it delivered has, but adults learn using, I just need to emphasize, people or adults in particular, that's anybody over the age of 16 roughly, tend to learn using an adult learning mechanisms. And it's important to understand that whatever technologies you put in place or whatever modes or mechanisms you build into that, it needs to leverage the fact that first of all there'll be knowledge acquisition, then there'll be contextualization, then there'll be application, and whatever the technologies are, unless the learning events or learning recognizes the way people learn, then you're building in resistance. So is there anything you'd like to add to that, Steph?
Only to reiterate, you've covered the answer very well, and it is the learning style. This is again, we don't want to get into academia too deeply, but there are theorists who have written and they've been challenged about their learning style questionnaires. But if you Google learning style questionnaires, you will get a number of alternative choices as to applying a learning style questionnaire. And the other thing I'd like to say, again, it's a bit theory to add to it, the knowledge acquisition, contextualization, and application is a theory from Bloom's taxonomy. So if anybody's interested or wants to look at those two theories, then obviously Google them, because you'll get a lot of information about them, and it would maybe help you with some further reading.
Okay, so going on from that answer and that question, how would you design online learning to ensure that it's engaging? And what are the exemplar models and platforms used? And perhaps you
there's a number. I think between us, we could probably be another hour on this subject, couldn't we? Having run a number of different e-learning projects, and admittedly, they were 10, 12 years ago now, where it was very intensely, I was project manager, and they were quite intense in the outcome being a tangible result. Ironically, because it is now an everyday item, it was one of the focus points of one of these projects was podcasting, and I don't think people were quite ready for it way back then. So the project itself was successful, but it was only because we were engaging with the right technology, with the right age group, and we preceded a lot of the production of some of the modules that the learning modules that we did produce by a lot of technology training. I mean, there are some exemplar learning portals out there, like the Open University, and there's Learning Tree and LinkedIn Learning, all of which have a particular structure to the way that they present what is going to be learnt. And everybody who has ever engaged in online learning will get used to a certain structure and pattern of, acquiring the knowledge, like you've said, Brayan, and then being challenged on it, either in a Q&A session or by answering questions in a quiz or a test. So online learning still needs to have that structure and that support and instructional design in order for you to get the delivery and the structure of a particular course, whatever that content may be, is really, really important. It isn't something without some research and probably being taught and qualified in that design yourself to be able to do so. So the bullet points I've put down to actually reiterate this, that all these institutions that you will go to for online learning, they all use a variety of platforms, and they could be anything from their own to one that's a quite expensive environment that you can buy. However, the course must still have a particular structure. So your knowledge is presented to you either through the written word, through a pre-recorded or live video. That's your acquisition of knowledge. You'll have a Q&A session, and then you can ask the lecturer, if you're obviously live, if it is synchronous learning. Your knowledge will be tested. If it's a credible qualification or course, you will be tested by some means of assessment. And assessment means you should then get feedback from that to know that you are on track and that what you are actually doing and creating and feeding back yourself and creating assignments or whatever the assessment methods are, you are being given feedback on that. And then, of course, that knowledge will then need to be applied by the learner, which would obviously be different depending on what the learning or what the actual subject area is. I hope that answers that particular question. Brayan, is there anything else you want to add on that, or should we move on to the next point?
No, there is something I'd like to add on that. That one of the things, or one of the weaknesses of online learning has always been the application of the knowledge, and we're seeing some super exciting technologies emerging at the moment, which allow for simulation. Allow application of knowledge within simulations. And I did allude to the fact that we were looking at virtual reality in 1996, believe it or not, but that it was super expensive. Now, with augmented reality on your iPhone 13 and virtual reality and through a 360-degree camera, for instance, there's lots of ways in which simulations to allow people to apply the knowledge can be built relatively cheaply and relatively quickly. And when the UK Armed Forces did some research into this, they found that you could get to about 80% fidelity. The things that you can't simulate very easily are smell and the kinesthetic, but audio and visual and sound cues can easily be built into simulations. So there's some seriously exciting emerging technologies, but it doesn't get you away from the fact that we're we've been evolving for the last 150,000 years, and we've evolved into learning machines that learn in a particular way. So nothing's changed in the way you learn, in my opinion. Nothing's changed in the fundamental learning process. It's just the technology has enabled different modes or different mechanisms to be brought to play to deliver the knowledge or what have you. So I'd just like to stress that the technology is an enabler for the delivery of learning. It is not going to change the process of learning.
Thank you. There's another couple of questions that we've put together as part of our panel discussion. The next one actually is one that refers back to the panel discussion that was recorded earlier in the week, where the role of HR was covered within industry and in businesses. I'll let you answer this question first, and then I'll come in after you. So what recommendations would you make to a management team in how to upskill their workforce, Brayan?
First of all, this is one that's actually quite close to my heart. And the answer is, first and most, have a demonstrable need for the learner to learn. Right? People are resistant to learning if there's no imperative. If there's no personal need for them to learn, then there's always the question of, why am I doing this? Why am I investing my time? So if you're going to give them a need, you also, as a manager, need to be giving them time. And we've alluded to this before. The culture has to support learning. It's not good enough, I'm afraid, to just say, sorry, you've got to get on with this, and by the way, you're doing it in your own time. Especially if there's very little in the way of imperative. So it's, to use the euphemism, it's much better to use the carrot rather than the stick. But having said that, what a lot of organizations do is they just use learning. I don't know, they don't seem to align the learning requirement with what is actually delivered. A lot of organizations that I've worked with in the past don't align the skilling or the knowledge, the knowledge that is required and the demonstration of knowledge, in other words, the skill, with the requirements. They just put people on courses, or I don't know, with some weird desire to tick a box. In other words, you've done this course, ergo you're competent. What they don't do is they don't give them the facility and space to apply the knowledge. Is there anything else you'd like to add to that stuff?
Yeah, I've got a couple of points. As you say, I actually ran the HR function in our business, and having subsequently been in industry and supporting as a consultant some other small businesses, I was very shocked to see that many small businesses see HR as a particularly add-on function for recruitment, and that's about it. So I think the point I'd like to make is that one of the first things that I introduced, obviously as part of the process of performance-related with staff performance. So I was actually part of a team who rewrote our HR process in order for staff appraisals to take place on a regular basis that would reflect on their KPIs, their performance to date, and identify with them on a one-to-one basis that what were the gaps in their individual skills. It was also identifying if there was new technologies within that capacity. So there could have been some, dare I call it, mandatory training that was a requirement for that particular person to be considered either for an additional role or for promotion. And I don't understand why, if you have more than a certain number of personnel, why you wouldn't have a very serious HR function that supports through line managers this appraisal of staff's performance. In order for staff, at the moment, there is a massive skill shortage. And in order to retain staff, staff are not always motivated by their salaries. One of the motivational elements of them staying in a job would be to engage in training and to see the potential of promotion. So, as much as the implementation of a performance management system with your staff, it actually allows you to retain staff in order for them to be the people that understand your business and get promoted through the business. And I've got a number of examples, which I won't go into detail on this particular forum, where that happened. We had a lot of staff that went through a lot of training with us in our previous business, Green Labyrinth Training, and a lot of them got promoted into quite senior roles. So we did practice what we preached, didn't we? And the last thing,
Can I
yeah,
just
sorry.
ask you a follow? Can I just ask you a follow-on question from that, which may be a little bit more controversial? How much of the HR function do you think is aligned to preventing litigation rather than developing the skills base of a company and managing and developing people?
If I'm honest with you, Brian, if there were any risk of any litigation, as you know, we had a consultancy. Any basic HR processes through the recruitment of staff, etc., we did internally. But it's to answer your question, in going through recruitment and making sure that the process was a legal process followed appropriately, and engaging staff with the right contracts and the right information at the at recruitment level, a lot of the HR policies are there in order for staff to understand how we expect them to either behave or perform within their role. But I think, as I said to you earlier, it was a rare occurrence when I was discussing operational performance, etc., with some smaller businesses, admittedly, how little they knew about how you can apply the performance management systems, and they're not legal requirement, but how much they embraced that and enjoyed implementing it and getting their staff re-engaged and motivated. And as I say, in our experience, a lot of ultimately some promotions on the back of that.
Okay.
So the final question we have, which is very topical, because there's a lot of assumptions that have been made about how teaching and learning and delivery of learning has changed during COVID. So, Brian, I'll let you start off, because obviously I have my points to make too. But do you think the changes that COVID forced upon educational institutions have changed the way that people learn? And if so, can you give some examples?
Okay, I think the short answer to that is it's not changed the way people learn. The fundamental manner in which we learn hasn't changed for millennia. It's just the modes. So we're creatures that have evolved a particular learning process, in my opinion. That
Yeah,
as
I agree.
we
Yeah.
mature, becomes more embedded. What COVID has done, though, is change the delivery media and the available modalities. For the learning industry, COVID has actually been a revolutionary, has provided a revolutionary impetus. In many ways, it has made good learning opportunities much more accessible. The downside of that is, unfortunately, it's done the same for bad ones. So poorly designed learning is just as accessible. as well as learning that delivers just plainly wrong knowledge. These can all be easily accessed. But let's look at the positives. What COVID has done is shown organisations and indeed people who want to learn that they don't have to go and sit in a classroom and learn in the old-fashioned way. What they can do is learn on demand. And from that point of view, it's actually removed a hell of a lot of barriers to knowledge acquisition. So as long as it's well designed, moderated, and accurate, it's fine. But unfortunately, there's a lot of online learning out there, which is easily accessible. It's just plain wrong. It delivers bad information and bad knowledge. Do you want to?
Yeah, well, I think from having gone through 2 years of COVID, obviously implementing that in an educational environment was extraordinary. We were very lucky in that we already had a digital plan or a digital strategy that we were implementing. And even that, as I say, had barriers with some of the teaching staff that we had. However, it was a reality that it existed. But I think there's probably a number of people that will be listening to this video in the next few weeks that will relate to the fact that the learning curve for all people who were not used to using Zoom or Teams or whatever other video platform, the learning within hours rather than months had to take place, or they were missing. They'd lost the way for them to communicate.
So
and that
was
was
a strong imperative, would you say? That it generates a strong imperative to learn.
And I think going back to some of the comments made earlier about the barriers to learning for certain adults and certain, I'm going to call them educationally disadvantaged, is not only did they struggle with technology prior to the lockdown, but the communication and the efficiency of communication using an online platform, as we are doing today, allows you to have such a larger reach. Your audience can be huge. It can be millions. It doesn't need to be limited to that classroom. And I mean, just one last final point. Some of our young people who, I mean, COVID has had a fundamental impact on the mental health of our young adults in the UK. And they have actually opted as a preference to learn from home moving forward. So looking at a lot of the negatives and positives of COVID, obviously there was a number of negatives, but in a learning environment, we did embrace the technology very quickly with lots of very quick updates for all our staff in order for them to continue the teaching and learning for the young adults that we were responsible for.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry.
I was just going to add to that one of the downsides of this is the lack of socialization, and part of the contextualization of learning that adults go through is they socialize it. They say, well, in my experience, you see it all the time when you're actually face to face with them. In my experience, or when I apply this to my particular context, so the socialization of learning is something that we need to be really worried about with individuals that want to isolate themselves.
Agreed. But rather than not accessing learning at all, this was just their preference and their alternative. And hopefully, with certainly a lot of the support services are on board, not just the educational ones. We hope that these young people will re-engage in mainstream education eventually.
Okay.
Well, that concludes our questions, and I think we are perfectly within our time frame. Once again, I'd like to thank Christina for inviting us to do this recording for Global Digital Week 2022. Brayan, would you like to say a final few words?
Yes, there's huge resources out there to help organisations. But as with most things, there's good and bad. So anything that is trying to deviate you away from what you know to be correct is probably not good for you, or not good, especially when you're dealing with fundamental processes like learning. However, embrace the technologies that are emerging, because the technologies can be leveraged substantially to improve the outcomes of learning. So I'd just like to again thank Christina and the team for the opportunity to contribute to this. And obviously, if anybody would like us or like further information, then please feel free to contact me.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Farewell.
Farewell indeed.